In this, the 29th lesson in the course A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine the outcomes of economics policies pursued in the United States during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. The election of Ronald Reagan to the U.S. presidency promised a new direction in economic policies, characterized by further cuts in taxes on capital gains and on high individual incomes, a commitment to freer trade, and to deregulation of industries and financial markets. Paul Volcker, as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, faced some very difficult challenges trying to apply the powers of the Federal Reserve banks to halt inflation. Volcker later provided his perspective on these challenges. He wrote, "By the time Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981, monetary policy was again fully engaged in restraint. To me, the new administration's economic officials were a rather odd mixture of hard-boiled monetarists and what came to be popularized as supply-siders, mixed in with a few pragmatists like the new chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Murray Weidenbaum. The Reagan administration also had to respond to the prospect of a global financial meltdown. In 1981, the current account deficit of the 16 largest third world borrowers totaled $55 billion. The 1979 oil price shock had sparked a renewed global recession, and the debt owed by many nations was subject to rising and floating rates of interest. While government revenue was declining, interest payments for all developing countries more than tripled from $20.7 billion in 1978 to $71.7 billion in 1982. In 1982, the governments of Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina announced they were no longer able to service their debt. The challenge was how to protect exposed banks in the West while imposing economic discipline on the debtor nations. In 1982, 22 countries were forced to negotiate debt rescheduling because they could not meet their contractual payments. Defaults were prevented by the intervention of the U.S. government, by central bankers, by the Bank for International Settlements, the IMF, and the World Bank. Austerity programs were imposed on debtor nations with the following conditions: raise taxes, cut spending on social welfare, reduce domestic consumption, and export commodities to obtain foreign currencies. All of the debtor countries suffered a flight of financial reserves by the wealthy to what they considered safe harbors. The problems for the debtor nations and the banks were long in the making. Almost everywhere there were problems of domestic economic management and political corruption. Many countries had great difficulty collecting tax revenue. Escalating oil prices in 1973 and 1974, and again in 1979 and 1980, exacerbated structural problems in many countries. Declining export prices and volumes associated with global recession during 1981 and 1982 deepened the dependence on borrowing at the very time when interest rates were climbing upward. President Reagan was prompted by Jack Kemp to adopt supply-side tax cuts as advised by economist Arthur Laffer. The expectation was that the added disposable income gained by individuals would be spent or invested, stimulating economic growth, and more tax revenue than would have occurred with higher tax rates. What Arthur Laffer and other proponents of these tax reductions failed to understand or foresee was that a huge portion of the added disposable income was directed into purely passive investments in the financial markets rather than in the production of new capital goods or new employment opportunities. the door was now open to an economic future dominated by the purchase and sale of financial instruments, as well as speculation in land and natural resources, rather than goods production. With Reagan's encouragement, the Congress passed and Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Act of 1981. Marginal income tax rates were reduced by 25% over 3 years, the top rate falling from 70% to 50%, while the bottom rate dropped from 14% to 11%. Tax rates were indexed, although the indexing was delayed until 1985. Of great importance to economic growth, but which was not even discussed by the Reagan economic advisors, or raised by Arthur Laffer for that matter, was the need to distinguish between earned and unearned, essentially windfall income flows. The failure to make such a distinction would have serious consequences for the economy going forward. After the 1983 changes in tax rates, the proportion of revenue coming from the top 10% of taxpayers increased considerably. However, what the graph does not reveal is that the top 1 or 2% enjoyed the greatest increases in gross and after-tax income. The benefits did not trickle down very far. Payroll taxes and the effective tax rates on the lower 2 income quintiles increased. Analysis by the Joint Economic Committee of the Congress concluded that the administration's forecasted increase in revenue from the tax cuts proved to be inaccurate. Increased government spending was not matched by private sector spending on new capital goods. The national debt increased from $700 billion to $3 trillion, and servicing this debt absorbed more and more of the federal tax revenue. Recession in the United States continued to deepen throughout 1981 and 1982. Business bankruptcies in 1982 rose 50% over 1981. Farmers were hard hit by the combination of declining crop prices and rising interest rates. Official unemployment peaked at over 10.7% in 1982. As the Reagan tax cuts took effect, the additional financial reserves made their way into the national and global economy, but not as investments by industry in new plant and equipment. Other countries were finding their own way from the days of Keynesian demand management to far less regulated and lesser taxed economies. Britain under Margaret Thatcher was leading the way, paid for by a windfall from North Sea oil revenues. Thatcher accepted the advice of monetarist economist Milton Friedman that the most important objective was to bring down inflation and reduce the government's deficit spending. Surprisingly, taxes were initially raised. Not surprisingly, government spending was cut. At the same time, credit was tightened by increasing interest rates. Inflation did fall, and fall rapidly, with falling energy costs leading the way. Nevertheless, Britain was also pulled into a recessionary downturn. At the start of 1982, there were nearly 3 million people unemployed, over 750,000 of whom were categorized as long-term unemployed. Only Belgium reported a higher rate of unemployment among European nations. The Thatcher government secured votes from Britain's middle class by cutting taxes and attempted to quiet the unemployed by strengthening the safety net. These measures would have been impossible without the North Sea oil revenues, which by the mid-1980s provided the government with 10% of its revenues. Even so, the British people were seriously divided over the policies of their government. Unlike Norway, which taxed the oil in order to upgrade the nation's infrastructure and encourage new industries, Britain spent its oil revenues on current expenditures. Almost nothing was allocated for modernization of industry. Another consequence of the oil revenues was to drive up the exchange value of the British pound. Thus, the competitive position of Britain's manufacturing sector fell even lower, leaving hundreds of thousands of workers without employment. In June of 1984, Ronald Reagan, Pierre Trudeau of Canada, Giscard d'Estaing of France, Helmut Kohl of Germany, Bettino Craxi of Italy, Yasuhiro Nakasone of Japan, all joined Margaret Thatcher at Lancaster House in London for the 10th G7 summit to discuss the world economic situation. Among the many consensus statements issued, one of the most important, if actually adopted, dealt with the elimination of barriers to trade between nations. The statement said, to urge all trading countries, industrialized and developing alike, to resist continuing protectionist pressures, to reduce barriers to trade, and to make renewed efforts to liberalize and expand international trade in manufactures, commodities, and services. Economists who understood the problem of rentier privilege, of land and natural resource monopolies, might have recalled the words written by Henry George in his book, Protection or Free Trade. George had warned, free trade means free production. Now, fully to free production, it is necessary not only to remove all taxes on production, but also to remove all other restrictions on production. True free trade, in short, requires that the active factor of production, labor, shall have free access to the passive factor of production, land. To secure this, all monopoly of land must be broken up, and the equal right of all to the use of the natural elements must be secured by the treatment of the land as the common property and usufruct of the whole people. The partial reform miscalled free trade, which consists in the mere abolition of protection, cannot help the laboring classes, because it does not touch the fundamental cause of that unjust and unequal distribution which, as we see today, makes labor a drug and population a nuisance in the midst of such a plethora of wealth that we talk of overproduction. In short, the elimination of barriers to trade were destined to largely result in the transfer of any increased nominal wages gained by workers and revenues generated by increased commerce to those who controlled the land in each trading nation. We've reached the end of Lesson 29.